Hello everyone, and welcome to the 194th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Pearl from the X film series. I've been wanting to cover Pearl ever since X and Pearl released back in 2022, but I was waiting to see if we'd get more of her story in Maxine before I did so. And though that didn't really happen, I'm glad I did for reasons you'll see later on in this video. Pearl is a fascinating character, and T. West and Mia Goth are fantastic directors and actresses respectively, which in my opinion has made for one of the premier film watching experiences of the last few years. And if you haven't seen this trilogy yet, I highly recommend that you do so. In Pearl especially, we're given insight into all the little pieces that go into making a killer like Pearl into the monster that she is. And in X, we get to see just how far into depravity a person like Pearl can descend when they're left to fester in their own darkness and isolation for decades, leaving us with one of the most memorable and standout villains in the psycho-biddy subgenre of horror. And in this video, we're going to run through all the information we're given about her character in these films that has made Pearl into a horror icon. Now without further ado, let's begin. 1918 was a tumultuous year for the entire world. World War I was tapering down, but still raging. And the flu pandemic that would end up killing anywhere from 10 to 100 million people in the span of just 2 years began in this year. It's during this perilous time period on a farm in rural Texas where we find a girl in torment, and the family she desperately wishes to escape from. But when you examine Pearl's life, you'll find that not only was it comfortable for the time period, but for any time period. Pearl lived on an expansive farm that had access to fresh water, plenty of crops, and livestock, and I don't know if her home was new, but it looked pretty well maintained, giving Pearl and her family a solid roof over their heads and a whole host of resources that could ensure their prosperity and comfort for decades to come. But a nice house and food aplenty aren't the only aspects of a person's life that determines their happiness and prosperity, for there have been plenty of people who've lived in this world that enjoyed a comfortable bed and a full stomach, who still had to suffer through horrors unending due to the actions of the people who were supposed to care for them. So when we look at Pearl's family and their treatment of her, what do we find? Well, quite a few concerning things, but on the whole, nothing that's really too damning. Pearl's father has been paralyzed for an unsaid amount of time, and though Pearl is forced to care for her father instead of the other way around due to his illness, that's not a burden that her father purposefully placed upon her. Her mother, though she is quite strict, doesn't seem to be abusive. She's rather demanding of Pearl when it comes to doing her chores, taking care of her father, or keeping herself protected from the flu when she goes into town. But otherwise, her treatment of Pearl isn't something to get too worked up over when you take a deeper look at why she treats Pearl the way she does. She is rough with her commands, and rather stony and cold, but maintaining an expansive farm like theirs and taking care of a paralyzed husband aren't easy tasks, so it makes sense that she'd be rather stressed and eager for her daughter to help lighten her load. Something else to consider is that Pearl's mother is German, and I'm sure during the past 4 years she's had to contend with the deaths of several friends and family members who lost their lives either fighting in their Kaiser's War or when the war was brought to their homes, which is an incredibly stressful thing to experience. And when you add in the fact that there's a deadly sickness going around that would more than likely kill her, her daughter, or her ailing husband if they contracted it, and you have the perfect recipe for one highly stressed, grief-stricken, and overworked woman who desperately needs her daughter's assistance during this trying time in her life. With all that being said, in truth, her rather blunt and cold attitude towards her daughter is something that we might be able to factor into Pearl's development into the killer she became. But because we don't know if Pearl's mother has always acted this way towards her daughter, it's hard to say, as while it is possible that Pearl's mother has always treated her daughter this way, considering the facts of her life at the beginning of this film, as well as her admission towards the middle of the film that she's been aware of her daughter's dark tendencies for some time, it could be that how she treats Pearl in this film is a rather recent development that, while clearly causing Pearl to resent her mother, isn't exactly unwarranted behavior. The only indicators we're given that Pearl's mother might have always been this way is when Pearl tells her mother after she's been burned to remember this pain because it's how she felt whenever she looked at her, which again, might be a recent development. And the other is when she tells Mitzi before her audition that she's used to feeling fear. But considering this statement comes off the back of a quick series of frightening events, it could be that that is what she's referring to. However, it is true that a person treating another in the way that Pearl's mother does isn't exactly conducive to promoting the positive behavior that you expect from them or building a healthy relationship with them. As though harsh treatment and punishments can work in your favor, when you're dealing with a child who's petulant and displaying abnormal harmful behavior, more often than not, you're only going to amplify those behaviors by treating them in a negative way. But as I said a moment ago, we don't know how long Pearl's mother has been treating her this way, and it's entirely possible that she tried to instill discipline and moral values within her daughter in a positive and healthy way for many years. But after suffering through a series of hardships, she became a broken woman who couldn't help but project her anger and frustration onto her daughter. And while that isn't necessarily excusable, it certainly is understandable given the circumstances. In the end though, the true battle between Pearl and her mother is one of selfishness versus selflessness, and both of them are justified in defending either concept. On the one hand, Pearl's insistence that she be able to make her life what she wants it to be is understandable, but on the other, Pearl's mother's insistence that she help keep their family afloat in their time of need is also understandable, even more so in fact. We all have dreams, and we all aspire to make ourselves into the people that we want to be. But as Pearl's mother points out, getting what you want in life isn't what's important, making the most of what you have is, as life rarely turns out how you expect, and you need to be prepared for that if you want to be happy. Pearl's mother is speaking from experience here, as due to everything she's been through, her outlook on life is rather cynical, but she does have a point, even if it is a little off the mark. It isn't necessarily true that getting what you want isn't important, as we should all be able to at least try to obtain what we want, and place some importance in that. It is true though, that when we don't get what we want, or when we're presented with obstacles that prevent us from obtaining what we want, we do have to make the most of what we have. Some people get to dance across the stage by day and return home to luxury at night, and others toil day and night to provide for their families or shoulder the burdens that have been forced upon them by a cruel and uncaring world. It's never fair when a family member falls ill and you're forced to drop some of the things you had planned for your life, but it's not something that you can account for, and it's not something that you can blame anyone for either. It's more so a play the hand you're dealt type situation, with the alternative being you abandon your loved ones when they need you the most. Whichever choice you end up making, it's going to be unfair to either you and your independence, or them and their inability to survive without your assistance. So yes, Pearl isn't wrong for asking when she'll get what she wants, but she is wrong for asking that question when her family needs her. And while she isn't obligated to stay and help her mother care for her father, I believe it would be the wrong thing for her to do, despite her mother's attitude towards her. An attitude that might soften a bit if Pearl would take the time to reflect on why her mother is constantly angry with her, and take action to improve their relationship by doing right by her and her father. With these things in mind, I don't think it makes sense to blame Pearl's parents directly for turning her into the monster she was. That being said though, they did contribute to it in an indirect way, with the isolated country life they chose to live, her father's illness, and her mother's possible long-standing negative attitude towards her daughter. But again, I wouldn't necessarily fault her parents for these things. They're just unfortunate results of the choices they made, the hand they were dealt, and the time period they lived in. So is that all that made Pearl into a murderer? A bit of hard work, a strict and cold mother, and some hard circumstances? No, but they certainly helped. Pearl at the beginning of her story seems ordinary enough. She's an idealistic young woman yearning for greater things, who's stuck at her family home caring for her ailing father. But it's not long before we see that Pearl is a bit off in several ways. We see this when she kills a goose and feeds it to her pet gator Theta, when she engages in simulated fornication and a bizarre erotic dance with a scarecrow, and when she tests the limits of her father's ability to feel by prodding him and choking him. While these moments do show us the stranger aspects of Pearl's character, what really stands out about Pearl is the fact that she's rather childlike in the way she moves, speaks, and thinks. Her mannerisms, depending on the situation, can be whimsical, jovial, and over the top, but she also displays this strange mixture of childlike innocence, curiosity, and cruelty that's present whenever we see her committing the various crimes she commits. And to watch Pearl brutalize others with her wide-eyed stares and petulant mannerisms is highly unsettling. While it only really happens a few times, another example of her childish behavior can be found in her tantrums and the overdramatic way she handles rejection, which are just as unsettling and childlike as her overall persona is when she's not caught in the throes of her emotions. But aside from these aspects of her personality, the most notable things about Pearl are her naivete, idealism, and narcissism, all of which go hand in hand with the childishness of her character. And now that we've reached this point, let's start talking about what specifically made Pearl into the woman we see in these films. There are 4 major things that made Pearl into who she is: her aforementioned lot in life, neglect, her belief that she's somehow special, and the desire to be a star that was formed in her by her exposure to new forms of entertainment. Now, as far as neglect goes, we see Pearl being neglected by her mother as she performs her duties. And I suppose you could call a husband being away at war a form of neglect. But in both these cases, the neglect isn't purposeful, and I think that was true for the majority of Pearl's life. As I said earlier, maintaining a home and taking care of a farm aren't easy tasks, and while it must have been easier when Pearl's father was healthy and they had the funds to hire farmhands, it still requires a lot of hard work to keep going. With that in mind, I'm sure Pearl was neglected throughout her entire life, in the sense that her parents were more so busy with the everyday tasks necessary to keep a farm running than they were with keeping their daughter entertained. And while that's a perfectly valid reason to focus less of your attention on your daughter, it's also something that can lead to feelings of loneliness, despair, and resentment within the person being neglected. Not to mention that Pearl likely had to work alongside her family to keep their farm thriving from a young age, which only further fueled the feelings I just described. It's also noted by Mitzi when her and her mother come to deliver a pig to Pearl's family that living in isolation for so long can't be healthy, which confirms that Pearl likely lived a fairly isolated existence with her family for her entire life, as outside of her marriage to Howard and her friendship with Mitzi, we don't ever receive any mention of Pearl's friends or other relatives, which would have made her a lonely little girl in a world of constant toil whose only friends were the animals her family kept, or the gator down at their pond. And I'm sure this neglect and isolation contributed heavily to Pearl's overall growth being stunted, and so I think we can attribute her childlike tendencies to the fact that she was never properly educated on social or worldly matters due to her isolation, lack of human connection with anyone outside their family, and the emotional disconnect from living beings that formed in her as a result. Something else that reinforces the idea that Pearl was neglected and lonely is her statement during her monologue later in the film when she's talking about how she hated being pregnant because she'd have to take care of a life. And the reason she hated it is because she views life as something terrifying due to it being harsh, bleak, and draining in her eyes. What this indicates is that Pearl's experiences toiling for her family on her farm and living a lonely and neglected existence because of her parents' choices instilled within her the idea that life is filled with nothing but hard work and disappointment. But dreams offer so much more than life does, which is something Pearl relies on far too much that we'll be discussing soon. So Pearl was a friendless, hardworking girl with hardworking parents who had little time to spend bonding with their daughter, and what made things even worse for Pearl is something that all of us have to deal with unless we're born into the heights of wealth and power, seeing others around her with more who work less, which sparked a dire envy in Pearl for the finer things in life and the desire to escape the world she'd been handed so she too could enjoy a life of luxury and leisure. Now, as Pearl herself admits, and as her mother points out during an argument with her, Pearl has shown signs of being a bit off for a long time now, as Pearl has apparently been killing small animals for her own amusement for quite a while, which, as many of you will be aware, is a sign that someone has developed or is developing antisocial personality disorder, a classification that has replaced the term psychopath and sociopath in the world of psychology that all of you will know well. However, replace might not be the right word to use here, as though they are technically outdated terms, they are still useful when describing people with this disorder, as though one of the defining traits of this disorder is a person's inability to feel empathy or their lessened capacity to feel it. Essentially, a psychopath is a person with ASPD that's more put together, methodical, and less impulsive, while a sociopath is a person who is more so ruled by their impulses. Many of you will have heard me read off the symptoms of ASPD in other videos, but for those of you who aren't aware of them, let's review what they are so we can better understand how they apply to Pearl's character. If you've heard all this one too many times and want to skip ahead a bit, I've included a timestamp for you. From the Mayo Clinic's website, symptoms of antisocial personality disorder include repeatedly ignoring right and wrong, repeatedly telling lies to take advantage of others, repeatedly using charm or wit to manipulate others for personal gain or pleasure, repeatedly having a sense of superiority and being extremely opinionated, repeatedly having problems with the law, including criminal behavior, repeatedly being hostile, aggressive, violent, or threatening to others, repeatedly feeling no guilt about harming others, repeatedly doing dangerous things with no regard for the safety of self or others, repeatedly being irresponsible and failing to fulfill work or financial responsibilities. Adults with antisocial personality disorder usually show symptoms of conduct disorder before the age of 15. Symptoms of conduct disorder include serious, ongoing behavior problems, such as aggression towards people and animals, destruction of property, lying and dishonesty, theft, and serious violation of rules. Sounds an awful lot like Pearl to me, but I want to be clear about something here. Pearl is a killer who in all likelihood has ASPD, but there are millions of people across the world who have this disorder, and not all people with ASPD are psychopaths or sociopaths, and even less still are killers or will become killers. But especially when it comes to spree killers or serial killers, more often than not, they have this disorder, and such is the case with Pearl, who is definitely a sociopath. Her development of this disorder makes sense, as experiencing trauma, abuse, or neglect in one's youth are things that heavily contribute to the manifestation of ASPD. And while it seems like Pearl wasn't abused or experienced any traumatic events as we've discussed, we have talked about the ways that she could have been neglected, not to mention the isolation that further contributed to her disconnect from other people, both of which led to stunted emotional development as she forged her own path in the world she found herself in, leading her natural curiosity to develop without moral or empathetic limitations that eventually led to her killing small animals, which only further contributed to her development of ASPD. Why killing small animals as a child is often seen as a sign that a person is developing ASPD is because it instills within a person from an early age a lack of empathy for living things, which only becomes more solidified as they repeat this behavior, furthering the disconnect between themselves and others, and lessening their capacity to empathize with others and see them as people with feelings just like their own, which then led to Pearl becoming the monster she was. Now the thing about Pearl though, is that she displays quite a lot of narcissistic tendencies, and so maybe she has a different disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, which is similar to, yet different from ASPD. Let's read through the symptoms of NPD that we can find on the Mayo Clinic website and see how they align with Pearl's character. People with narcissistic personality disorder can have an unreasonably high sense of self-importance and require constant, excessive admiration, can feel that they deserve privileges and special treatment, can expect to be recognized as superior even without achievements, can make achievements and talents seem bigger than they are, can be preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, beauty, or the perfect mate, can believe they are superior to others and can only spend time with or be understood by equally special people, can be critical of and look down on people they feel are not important, can expect special favors and expect other people to do what they want without questioning them, can take advantage of others to get what they want, can have an ability or unwillingness to recognize the needs and feelings of others, can be envious of others and believe others envy them, can behave in an arrogant way, brag a lot, and come across as conceited, can insist on having the best of everything, for instance, the best car or office. At the same time, people with narcissistic personality disorder have trouble handling anything they view as criticism. They can become impatient or angry when they don't receive special recognition or treatment, can have major problems interacting with others, and easily feel slighted, can react with rage or contempt and try to belittle other people to make themselves appear superior, can have difficulty managing their emotions and behavior, can experience major problems dealing with stress and adapting to change, can withdraw from or avoid situations in which they might fail, can feel depressed and moody because they fall short of perfection, can have secret feelings of insecurity, shame, humiliation, and fear of being exposed as a failure. Well, as it turns out, most of the symptoms associated with NPD apply to Pearl as well. So is it possible for a person to be diagnosed with two different personality disorders? Yes, it is, as a lot of symptoms between personality disorders tend to overlap, and in Pearl's case, we can assign her the unique designation of being a narcissistic sociopath. Now, something that's always pertinent to discuss when examining people with a personality disorder who then become killers is to ask yourself whether they were born that way or whether they became that way due to outside factors, which is a question that's part of a larger question about the human experience that is yet to be answered. That being, are we born evil or are we made evil? I've never been a proponent of the idea that we're born evil, and depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. But though I don't believe anyone is born evil, I do believe that it's a combination of both nature and nurture that causes a person to become evil. As though I do think it's erroneous to state that people are born evil, I do think it's accurate to state that there are people who are born with a greater capacity to become evil when exposed to different things. There are aspects of each of our personalities that cause us to react to different things differently. For example, one person might hear opera music for the first time and fall in love, and the next might do the same and develop an instant hatred for it. The same thing can be said for everything in this world, including all of the negative things we experience in our lives. With that in mind, there is no guarantee that a person who lived in the same environment and experienced the same things as Pearl would develop in the same way that she did. But because that's true, that must mean that there is something within Pearl's character that caused her to react to everything she experienced in the way that she did. And why this is important to consider is because, as we've already discussed, the world Pearl lived in wasn't particularly terrible, and neither were the people around her. But because Pearl is the person that she is, what might have had a small effect on someone else had a gargantuan effect on her. And that's something important we should all keep in mind, that just because you see things one way or something affects you in a certain way doesn't mean that it's the same for someone else. And what you might consider to be inoffensive could be life-changing for another. And that's true for the last major contributor to Pearl's development into a killer, her exposure to the world of entertainment. Everything that we've talked about so far about Pearl's life might not have made her into the killer she became. She would have always harbored feelings of resentment towards her parents and her way of life, and she would have always been envious of those around her. But it was her exposure to cinema that really sealed the deal for Pearl. Mass media has decided the course that many people throughout our history would take, and for every one person who makes it in the entertainment world, there are millions more watching them who see them gain wealth, prosperity, and the adoration of thousands through their art and talents, who then form the desire to do the same. And that's certainly not a bad thing, as the desire to become a star has unlocked the hidden potential within millions, if not billions of people that might have lain dormant otherwise. Though that may be true, ambition can be a poison, as it can drive you to do things that negatively impact you or the people around you. And if you're not a person who can bear to suffer any sort of disappointment, well then your ambitions are likely going to lead you towards a world of distress rather than a world of success. Growing up in the early 20th century, children and adults alike were exposed to new technological marvels that instilled feelings of wonder and awe within them. And for the average person, I imagine there are few things that could surpass the feelings one must have felt when they viewed their first movie. But movies weren't just a wondrous marvel of progress and a source of entertainment. They were living proof of a place that anyone, no matter how rich or how poor, could escape to find unprecedented fame and fortune by projecting their image on thousands of screens across not just the country, but the entire world. Now, Pearl had probably desired to leave her family's home for a long time before she saw her first film, as even after she had seen it, she had intended to use her marriage to Howard as a means to escape her home, which is a much more realistic way to gain one's freedom than obtaining stardom is. And Pearl's goal above all else has always been to escape the farm no matter what, so she won't end up like her mother, and so she'll be able to gain the love she never felt from her parents throughout the many years that they neglected her. But when Pearl was exposed to cinema, an overwhelming desire to be a star was formed within her, and it's this desire, more than her general desire to leave home, that would lead her down a path towards greater evil. Pearl had been searching for a way to escape the family farm for years, and as I said a moment ago, she initially pinned her hopes on her marriage to Howard, a boy from a wealthy family who she hoped would take her away from her home and grant her the life of luxury and ease she'd always craved. But Howard had fallen in love with her family's farm, and before he signed up to fight in the Great War, he made it clear that their future lay at that farm, something that Pearl considered a grave betrayal alongside his choice to leave her to fight abroad. So Pearl started to lean more and more into her dream of becoming a dancer worthy of the cinema, and it might have remained but a pipe dream if it weren't for the influence of two people, Mitzi and the projectionist. The thing about Pearl's aspirations to become a star is that prior to learning about the dance competition from Mitzi, it was an unrealistic fantasy because we never see Pearl making a plan to do so or practicing the skills she would need to become one. Therefore, it's more than likely that Pearl would have just kept on dreaming and surrendered her hopes of becoming a star upon her husband's return from the war. Though with Pearl becoming a powder keg of emotion and dark tendencies, perhaps something similar to what occurred in this story would have played out at some point in time regardless. But when Pearl met the projectionist, she was given hope that a person could just pick up and leave and become whatever they wished, and that anyone can do anything they want as long as they want it bad enough, which can be true, but is quite the dangerous notion to plant in the head of someone like Pearl. And then of course, Mitzi pointed her towards a means to possibly get her started on that road, the dance audition, and what ensues shows us that Pearl is as hopelessly delusional as she is self-absorbed. After Mitzi tells her about the dance, and she goes off that night to speak with the projectionist, Pearl is so sure that she is going to win this competition that the next day, she attempts to feed her father to Theta so A, he won't have to suffer anymore, and B, so her mother won't have to take care of him alone when she's gone. Thankfully, she's stopped by her mother, but in a symbolic gesture that she's going to leave everyone behind and continue on her path to stardom, Pearl takes one of Theta's eggs and makes as if she's going to nurture it and care for it, and instead, a moment later, she has a change of heart and chooses to crush the egg, with the image of Howard's exploding head in her mind as she does so. And that very night is when Pearl and her mother get into an argument that ends with Pearl accidentally causing her mother's dress to catch on fire, which she puts out with a pot of recently boiled water. Now this was the moment that led Pearl past the point of no return, because here, she was presented with a choice: run to town and get a doctor that could save her mother, or let her die so she could finally do what she wanted to do. But because Pearl is who she is, there was never two choices for a girl who was going to murder her father earlier that day, and so with starry eyes and delusions of grandeur, Pearl chose to drag her mother to the basement before she went off to spend a night of passion with a man who she believed could bolster her chances of obtaining stardom when she won her audition. And here is where things go from a smoldering 5 to a blazing 10. Pearl has convinced herself that this man she's only just met is going to take her away to Europe, and when she brings him back to her home and he catches glimpses of what she's done the night before, he's rightfully skeptical of what exactly is going on at that farm. And here we get a glimpse of a component of Pearl's delusions and narcissism that further solidifies for us how warped her view of the world and the people around her is. Pearl is so convinced that everyone around her is wrong about her that when anything she says or does is challenged by another person, she immediately becomes dejected or filled with rage. And while we saw this a bit during the fight with her mother, when the projectionist decides to investigate a noise in Pearl's house, and Pearl tries to keep him from doing so, he asks what's the matter with her, which changes Pearl's attitude from an eager and happy-go-lucky star to that of a beaten puppy. After he sees the mess in the kitchen, Pearl manages to lure this man away from her house by saying her dog caused all this commotion while she was away, and Pearl is worried here that her charade with this man is coming to an end. But she presses on and tries to salvage the situation by showing him her livestock, casually exclaiming that they used to have more, but they died, which I'm sure means that Pearl killed them. But after seeing her paralyzed father covered in drool and convulsing in her living room, hearing strange noises, and examining the struggle in the kitchen, the projectionist is wary of this woman he has only just met. And once Pearl's lies catch up to her, and she accidentally slips that they don't have a dog, the murderous child that is Pearl comes out in full force in one of the greatest tantrums I've ever seen in a film. Like the narcissist she is, Pearl is astounded that this man has suddenly gone cold on her, as she says, frantically asking him what she did wrong and what did he see. A mixture of worry and fear, manifesting as anxiety-ridden anger, bursting out from Pearl as everything she wants from this man and everything she tried to keep from him crumbles away. And when he turns his back on her, the only logical thing to do in Pearl's mind in that moment is to unleash all her anger and frustration upon this man and end his life in a most brutal fashion. The narcissistic sociopath tries to charm. They try to bend the world to their wants and needs, so all might adore them and grant them what they believe is theirs by right. But some, like Pearl, who have a great capacity to unleash evil on others, cannot keep their murderous impulses at bay when they become distraught. And the fact that Pearl is portrayed here as being an overgrown child who's breaking all her toys after she doesn't get what she wants is nothing short of a masterful display of excellent filmmaking and acting. So now all that was left for Pearl to do was attend her audition, but of course, since she was going to win, she needed to make sure all her loose ends were tied up before she went, which meant murdering her mother and father and guiding the projectionist in his car into Theta's pond. And if her choice to hide her dying mother in the basement was the moment where Pearl went past the point of no return, then the audition is when reality finally catches up to Pearl. Pearl tells Mitzi when she arrives that she has to be the one to win, as she has quite literally burned all her bridges back at home and in her town. And of course, because Pearl believes herself to be special, she's all but assured herself that she is going to win this audition. Now, why is she special? Because Pearl says she is. So, how is she going to win this audition and become a star? Well, she's special. So the judges are going to see that and know that she was born to be one. Of course, Pearl is in fact not so special at all, and during the audition, she is finally forced to come to terms with that fact. Pearl dances for these judges to the image of an imaginary battle scene. And while we the viewers get to see quite the show because we're able to see inside of Pearl's head, to the judges, I'm sure this was nothing more than a routine and bizarre display that they'd seen 1,000 times, as in lieu of creating and practicing her own routine, Pearl is only able to mimic what she's seen others do. And while it might have been fine enough, it was nowhere near enough to impress a panel of judges who are looking for fresh new talent. So in one fell swoop, the delusions come crashing down, and in a heart-wrenching display of sheer unbridled heartbreak, Pearl is forced to contend with the fact that not only is she still stuck on the farm, but she's murdered a man, as well as her own parents, leaving her as distraught and broken as her mother was, on an empty farm, surrounded by broken dreams and horrors of her own making. Now, the monologue we're given once Pearl and Mitzi return to the farm, following the audition, is one of the greatest pieces of acting I've ever seen. And if Mia Goth was any less the exceptional actress that she is, this could have easily been cheesy or a slog to get through. But there's so much raw emotion displayed here that when this nearly 8-minute monologue had concluded, I hardly noticed that much time had passed. This doesn't really have anything to do with Pearl's character, but it was damn impressive and deserves a lot of praise, so I thought I'd give it some. Now, we've already talked about a few different things that Pearl brings up during her speech here, but one of the more remarkable things about it that we haven't touched on yet is Pearl's admission that she's sick, that she feels like something is wrong with her, and that she desperately wants someone to tell her how to fix it. But as she's admitting these things, in the same breath, she talks about everything that she's done that has caused her to be in the pain she's currently experiencing. She admits that she was only using Howard as a means to escape the farm. She admits that the people she hurt didn't deserve it. She admits that her mother meant well, that she had a hard life, that she was just trying to feel safe, and that her father definitely didn't deserve what she did to him. And she admits that though she regrets everything she did now, she liked how it felt at the time. But instead of connecting the dots and realizing what she is here and recognizing that every dark thing she's done and admitted to has led her to this point, she instead defaults to a "why me" approach. Why was I born into a family that isn't rich? Why doesn't God answer my prayers? Why are you who you are? And why am I who I am? And that is ultimately Pearl's story, the girl who wanted more from her bleak existence, who never tried to make it better, but only hoped that one day it would be. That one day, people will recognize that she is the special person who deserves the world that she believes herself to be. And every bad thing that has ever happened to her, or that she has done, isn't her fault. And so appropriately, Pearl murders Mitzi after admitting all these things, and in an effort to make the best of what she has, like her mother had told her, and return her life to a semblance of normalcy, she props her dead parents up at the dinner table and tries to resume life as it once was. And when Howard returns after what seems like weeks considering the mold growing on the food at the table, something interesting occurs that seems to make no sense. Howard stays married to Pearl, despite being confronted with all she's done and the monster that she is. While this might seem far-fetched at first, considering all that we've just discussed about Pearl's character, I can find many reasons why Howard would have stayed with her. By all accounts, Howard truly loved Pearl and their way of life prior to going off to war, and so that love might have staved off any instinct to cut and run when he initially returned home. Howard also just returned from fighting in a war that is considered one of the most harrowing experiences for a soldier to experience, and like the millions who returned home following combat that were scarred beyond belief, Howard must have also suffered a similar bout of distress and returned a different man than he was when he left, regardless of his cheery demeanor at the time of his arrival back at the farm. With Pearl's monologue, which was a genuine display of emotion, we're shown that Pearl is more than capable of putting on a convincing show of emotion, and that coupled with the fact that I'm sure she did a lot of cleaning up prior to Howard's return, Pearl was more than capable of putting on a show for Howard and spinning a story for him that would have painted her as the victim rather than the offender here. Pearl probably fed Mitzi to Theta, and the projectionist car might have sunk further into the pond, erasing any evidence of that crime as well. While there might have been some stink made about the projectionist's disappearance in town, he did admit that he was a bohemian, so in all likelihood, people would have assumed he just picked up and left, and Mitzi's disappearance surely wouldn't have been blamed on Pearl either. And when her mother possibly came to question her about it, all Pearl had to say was that the last time she saw Mitzi was at the audition or when she left her house afterwards, and that would have been that. So I imagine Pearl played the victim here, perhaps telling Howard how her mother had finally snapped and killed her father. And then when Pearl and her got into a fight afterward, she accidentally caught fire and perished as well. And with Mitzi disappearing and her husband still away, Pearl was so distraught and lonely that she tried to put the pieces of her life back together by placing her parents at the dinner table, all of which the smitten and emotionally vulnerable Howard could have readily believed, afterwards helping his poor wife make everything better, as Howard at that time was apparently willing to do anything for his beautiful wife, according to Pearl. And so a man who experienced the horrors of war not once, but twice when he served in the Second World War, made it his duty to make the best of what he had with his now devoted wife. And so unlike the farm maintained by Pearl's parents, which had been vibrant and full of life, the Pearl and Howard homestead became the anathema of life, a decrepit and weed-choked landscape dominated by a ramshackle home and the buildings that surround it. And as time passed, Pearl slowly corrupted Howard into not just the enabler of a monster, but a monster of his own. With everything we've talked about in mind, what occurs 61 years later only makes too much sense. Pearl is still as delusional as ever, and apparently so is her husband now, as they have clearly been murdering people for some time by the time Maxine and her friends arrive at the farm. And it would seem their reasons for murdering people either stems from Howard's accusations of the men they board enticing his wife, or from Pearl's continued insecurity surrounding the life she never got to live, as well as her advanced age, causing those feelings to be amplified. So who knows how many lives were ended for the sake of Pearl's vanity, for the idea that she's special, and that everyone who gets what she wanted deserves to have it taken away from them. Pearl, try as she might, refused to accept that life and all the things you want from it aren't just handed to you, that no one person is born special, and that even those with talents need to hone them in order to find themselves counted amongst the greats in any passion they choose to pursue. But one of the themes of this film trilogy is not accepting a life that you don't deserve, a slogan that's even displayed in Pearl's town back when she was younger. And in truth, it is a powerful mantra to stand by. There are things that all of us want out of life, and barring circumstances that alter the course of our lives, that are out of our control, none of us should just lay down and accept a life that we don't feel is right for us. But making your life into what you want it to be requires a lot of hard work, and rarely are the things we want handed to us just because we want them. And unlike Pearl, her counterpart Maxine understands this. Maxine is every bit the woman Pearl wanted to be. She's a driven woman who believes that she's destined to be a star. But unlike Pearl, Maxine understands that to become such a star, you have to work hard and do whatever it takes. Maxine was also raised in a home where she was made to be someone that she never wanted to be. But in Maxine's case, it was to an even more extreme degree, as Pearl's inability to become who she wanted to be was blocked by her father's illness, while Maxine's destiny was guided by her evangelical father, who wished to shape her into the perfect scion of Christ that he wanted her to be. Pearl's limiting factor was understandable, as when your family is in need, sometimes you have to put their needs above your own. But Maxine's choice to leave her father behind was more so an escape from a controlling situation than it was a betrayal of her family. And what did Maxine do? She didn't cry or complain about how the world owed her stardom and assumed it would just hand it to her. She worked as hard as she possibly could to make her dreams a reality, spending every available second she had working towards her goals no matter the cost. While Maxine had to deal with Pearl and Howard's attempted murder of her, the deaths of several of her friends at their hands as well as at her father's hands, and her father's attempts to use her in an elaborate exorcism aimed at ridding America of the devil, she still managed to retain her sanity and persevere despite it all, something that the hopelessly lost Pearl was never capable of doing. While the odd and righteous brand of evil Maxine's father sowed is worth noting, Pearl's story, if you couldn't tell by the length of this video, gives us a detailed account of the circumstances and situations that can drive a person to become a monster, And while there are elements of Pearl's life that no person should have to experience, Pearl was born with unique traits that caused her to react to the world around her in the way that she did. And while I can find much sympathy for her story, that sympathy is overridden by the fact that Pearl became an overgrown child wielding an axe who at several points in her life made the choice to unleash harrowing and unwarranted amounts of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Pearl? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my members, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.